Hi, welcome to this book event. We're celebrating and discussing the new book by Bruce Hoffman and Jacob Ware, God, Guns, and Sedition, which is surely far-right terrorism in America, which surely will be the definitive account. And Bruce and Jacob are going to review some of the big themes and key stories in the book. I'll engage them in some Q&A. And then I'll moderate questions. If you have questions, put them in the Slido box and I will see them. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hoffman, who doesn't need any introduction, but is, amongst other things, the Shelby Cullum and Catherine Davis Senior Fellow for Counterterrorism and Homeland Security at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also a professor at Georgetown University, Walsh School of Foreign Service, and he's the author of multiple books on terrorism. Jacob Ware is a research fellow at the Council and is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and at DeSales University. So, Bruce, do you want to kick things off?
Sure. Thanks, Peter, very much for having us. It's a great pleasure and indeed honor to speak at a New America webinar. I remember, I think 7 or 8 years ago when you had me last time, we were doing things in person, and it was like today, a very sort of blustery, I think it was more snow than rain, but it's much better to be doing this from my study at home. So thank you for having us. We're really grateful. So Jacob and I have written a book. The title is God, Guns, and Sedition, Far-Right Terrorism in America. And let me unpack the title first, and then I'll tell you, I think, something about the book. Firstly, let's address the elephant in the room. Why now is there a book necessary on far-right terrorism? Jacob and I are by no stretch of the imagination arguing that this is the only terrorist threat facing the United States. It's not a partisan choice that we focus on the far right. In fact, one of the most consequential terrorist incidents in recent years was perpetrated in June 2017 by someone we could categorize as on the far left, at least, or on the left. He claimed to be a supporter of Senator Bernie Sanders, who attacked several congressional members of Congress, Republican members of Congress, who were practicing for the annual congressional baseball tournament. And as you may recall, seriously wounded 5 persons, including the then minority leader, Steve Scalise of Louisiana. But it's just the numbers on the far right completely eclipse a threat that is a bona fide threat in the United States as well from the far left and indeed from other actors. Cynthia Miller Idris, who's one of the leading scholars on extremism in the United States, and her book Hate in the Homeland put the number of armed far-right extremists as an estimated 75,000 persons. So that, I think, very clearly gives you some of the dimensions of the threat. The New York Times, a couple of years ago, in an excellent article it had on the militia movement, which is, of course, part of the extreme right universe in the United States, they put the number of armed militia members at 20,000. So we're talking big numbers. And in fact, if you look at the FBI's reporting in recent years, you can see overwhelming where the threat is coming from. In 2019, for example, the FBI had 850 active domestic terrorism investigations. That number doubled in 2020. It tripled in 2022. We're still awaiting the 2023 figures. That includes 3 big buckets, what they call racially motivated violent extremists, homegrown violent extremists of both the right and the left, and others such as incels, eco-terrorists, animal rights people, militant anti-abortion. But even within those figures of what's now, over 2,000 domestic terrorism investigations, overwhelming majority are of violent, and I'm emphasizing the violent, far-right extremists. We don't have a domestic terrorism statute in the United States, which is something Jacob will talk about in a few minutes about our policy recommendations. So we have to rely on non-governmental organizations like the Anti-Defamation League or Southern Poverty Law Center or others to get a feeling for really the specifics of this threat. And according to the Anti-Defamation League, all 25 extremist-related murders in about a dozen incidents during 2022 were linked to violent far-right extremists. And of that number, about 95% of them were committed by white supremacists or white nationalists. And this is part of a decade-long trend that the ADL has followed. Since 2012, 75% of the persons who have been killed in what I would call terrorist incidents in the United States, although bear in mind there's no terrorism statutes and they're not often referred in that way, but were perpetrated by far-right extremists, and about 73% of that number were by white supremacists. So clearly there's a disproportionate threat, and one that I think Jacob and I cogently argue in the book will heat up in 2024 as we approach a new, likely to be highly contested presidential election. Now, word about the title, and this turned out to be more serendipitous than deliberate, the choice of the title. After many iterations, anyone who writes a book knows that the hardest part of it isn't sitting down and writing it, it's figuring out what to name it. And we came up with God, Guns, and Sedition because it encapsulated the main themes. But then I realized afterwards it perfectly fit the historical trajectory that we talk about in the book. Main argument in the book is that this variant of extremism, of course, existed in the United States, especially since the Reconstruction period with the advent of the Ku Klux Klan. Was suppressed, not least as a result of the creation of the Department of Justice in 1870. And Jacob and I have an essay in Justice. What's the title, Jacob?
Just Security.
Just Security. Sorry. This is what happens when you're old. You forget where you publish things. In Just Security, that talks about how at another time of acute domestic threats, the Department of Justice was created to prosecute them. But in any event, there was a revival of the Klan, of course, in the 1920s, again in 19-teens and 1920s, again in the 1960s. But what was the genesis of the book was that in the late 1970s, early 1980s, some of the same phenomena we see today. Xenophobia, especially a dislike and distrust of immigrants. A certain ennui in the United States in the 1980 that the U.S. had just concluded, not terribly successfully, a quarter of a century long overseas military expedition to Southeast Asia that had given rise to lots of discontent amongst veterans and others, but also lack in confidence in elected officials. Hand in glove with both those things, you saw an anti-immigrant sentiment that morphed into racism. And around that time in the 1980s, the God part of the title refers to a movement that was evolving from, let's say, the white sheets of the Ku Klux Klan or the brown shirts and Sam Brown leather belts of the neo-Nazis to a movement that actually was seeking some justification from Scripture. And you found white supremacist churches, particularly the Church of Jesus Christ Christian, that were attempting to act as the glue to bind together a movement that was quite diverse and diffuse. Anti-government extremists, tax resistors, racists, anti-Semites, xenophobes, militant opponents of abortions. And there was, at that point, a salient religious element. In fact, many of the leaders of the movement then prefaced their name with pastor or reverend. And I'll say parenthetically, I was driving cross-country this summer, and whilst driving across Missouri, I saw two huge billboards for Church of Jesus Christ Christian parishes or churches. And when I consulted people who follow this extremely closely in that state, they said they're the same as the ones that existed in the 1980s. So this is a movement that hasn't died. The guns part refers to the 1990s. And that's really when, like any terrorist movement, is constantly searching for new constituents and constantly attempting to broaden its appeal. This movement went from this salient religious theme to now one that privileged Second Amendment rights, that were convinced during the Clinton administration that the United States government was intent on seizing legally held weapons. And this was, of course, one of the motivations that, amongst others, that inspired Timothy McVeigh to carry out what, after all, is the most lethal terrorist attack in the history of the United States, except for 9/11, which was the 1995 bombing of a federal office building in Oklahoma City that killed 168 persons. The FBI, following Oklahoma City, clamped down on the militia movement and on violent far-right extremists. And in fact, like many terrorism analysts. And I should have prefaced this by saying that when I started as a terrorism analyst 43 years ago now, my first account was violent far-right extremism, initially in Europe and then in the United States. So I'd worked on this issue all during the 1980s and 1990s, but then the FBI suppressed the movement. 9/11 occurred. Like every other terrorism specialist, I was riveted on the Al-Qaeda threat and then subsequently ISIS. And then the last thing I ever imagined in my career was returning to this particular threat. And we began the book in April 2020, which was a very dark time. We were in lockdown because of COVID. And I had been amazed at how quickly, literally within days of the lockdown in March, anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant, anti-Asian and Asian American, and also racist tropes began to surface, attempting to target these groups to blame for COVID. So let me turn it over to Jacob, who will explain why that happened, especially from the Obama administration. And that's when we get into the period of the book that really focuses on sedition.
Well, thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Peter, so much for having me. It's a real honor. Our chapter 6 is titled Racism Rekindled, and that refers to the reaction from some corners of the American public to the election of Barack Obama. Now, Bruce explained one of the big events in our book is the 1995 bombing of Oklahoma City. That led to quite a large crackdown on the far right in the Clinton administration. And it really goes dormant through those 9/11 years until Obama's election, which, aside from obviously resulting in the first Black president in American history, also leads to a huge surge in hate crimes perpetrated by white supremacists and anti-government extremists. Barack Obama actually, during the campaign, receives Secret Service protection earlier than any other presidential campaign in history due to the volume of threats against him. And this would be a kind of harbinger of things to come. During his administration, President Obama really faces two major far-right terrorist attacks. The first one happens in 2011 in Oslo and Utøya in Norway, where 77 people are killed, the overwhelming majority of whom are children at a summer camp of the youth wing of the Norwegian Labour Party. That gunman and bomber actually wrote a long manifesto that accompanies his attack. He calls his victims cultural Marxists. And he basically argues that he's choosing to try to cut off the head of the snake of multiculturalism by attacking the left and the next generation of left-wing politicians in order to try to reverse what he saw as an ongoing, deliberate demographic replacement of, I guess, ethnic Norwegians. In 2015, another attack occurs, this one in Charleston, South Carolina, perpetrated by a young man, a gunman, white supremacist called Dylan Roof, who kills 9 people during a Bible study at the Mother Emanuel AME Church in South Carolina. Both very significant events because they provide both tactical and ideological inspiration. One of the themes that we try to draw out in our book is how much these individuals learn from each other, how much they refer to each other. And these are both very significant moments during those years. The other really important development during the Obama years is the establishment, I guess, or normalization of social media as a major battlefield of basically every element of society, right? And the Obama administration faces the rapid, almost blitzkrieg emergence of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. We trace this moment as being very important for the development of the far right as well, in part because ISIS really shows how powerful social media can be in mobilizing 21st century political movements, but also because it leads to a huge rise in immigration into Europe, which is used by many American far-right extremists as well as European far-right extremists as further justification of this great replacement that they see being deliberately orchestrated by the left and by Jews. So 2016 and 2017 come along. The United States has a new presidential election, and obviously President Trump is elected. The first really significant moment, and it's a transformational moment for the modern far right, occurs on August 11th and August 12th, 2017, in a small town, a college town called Charlottesville, Virginia, where a group of outspoken, explicit, proud white supremacists and neo-Nazis and anti-government extremists gather at what they call the Unite the Right rally. Okay, so the idea is we're going to unite the right here in defense of what was a Confederate statue that was going to be taken down. A terrorist attack occurs there at Charlottesville. A young paralegal, Heather Heyer, is killed. And in the wake of the incident, something really important happens in the political scene. President Trump finds himself wavering on whether to condemn the events or not. And there's this very famous line where, after several days of back and forth with the media, President Trump says, "There were very fine people on both sides." This remains a huge moment in the emergence of the modern violent far right, because they felt that they could organize publicly and that they could commit acts of violence in defense of the ideology, and that they would have protection from the White House. Charlottesville marks the coming out party of a new far right, which dubbed itself the alt-right, characterized by youthfulness, viciousness, mobilization online, and passionate support for President Trump. Now, from there, I would argue, until really the start of the COVID pandemic, which Bruce discussed in March and April 2020, that window, that kind of 2.5-year window there, is where we really see a huge spike in violent far-right violence that grips the attention of terrorism scholars like Bruce and I, but also of Western governments. Around the midterms in 2018, of course, you have the pipe bomb incident targeting several leaders in the media and in the political left. Shortly thereafter, we have the deadliest anti-Semitic terrorist attack in US history at Pittsburgh. March 2019, a twin shooting occurs in Christchurch, New Zealand, targeting the Muslim community there, killing 51 worshippers. The following month, there's a terrorist attack in a place called Poway in California at a synagogue. That August, we have the deadliest terrorist attack against the Latino community in the United States that occurs in a place called El Paso, Texas. And then a number of smaller incidents also occur in Europe until the end of kind of 2019. So we see this enormous explosion of white supremacist and anti-government violence that really grips the attention of Western governments. COVID comes along and provides a big boost to radicalization and extremist ideologies. And we spend a lot of time in the book talking about how conspiracy theories were able to really accelerate based on what occurred during COVID. I think we actually have a quote in there that says basically that pandemics are kind of tailor-made for conspiracy theorists. And we see a big climb in extremist organizing. And 2020 ends up being this tremendously tumultuous year, right? With COVID pandemic and Black Lives Matter protests, and this very contentious political moment leading up to an election in which we have basically two candidates who are both claiming victory in that election. Leads up to January 6th, which I would argue is the most important moment in our book and the most serious threat to American democracy that we catalog in our work. It's the first breach of the Capitol since 1814. And we find, as Bruce kind of laid out, that January 6th is really the culmination of a movement that's been building for decades, that had kind of the momentum and the opportunity towards the end of the Trump administration to really launch this very consequential attack that remains, you know, as we've just passed the 3-year anniversary, remains a very significant moment. May 14th, 2022, there's kind of one last major event that Bruce and I unfortunately have to write about towards the end of the book, which is another mass shooting, this one targeting, again, the African-American community in Buffalo. There are 10 fatalities by an individual, an 18-year-old, who writes as part of a heavily plagiarized manifesto that, quote, "There is no non-white living on white lands that is innocent." And that sentence, I think, really captures a lot of what Bruce and I find and sadly have to write about over the previous kind of 50 years that we cover in the book.
Jacob seems to have frozen.
Rose, yeah. Are you back, Jacob?
Am I
There
back?
it is. Yeah, you're back now.
Sorry about that. I'll turn it back over to you, Bruce, to talk about how we divide our recommendations into three buckets and why we decided to take that approach. Sorry about that.
Yeah. No, and I'll wrap up here because we want to allow sufficient time for questions. So one of the largest chapters is actually the last one, which is the policy recommendations. And we basically divided these into three different categories. Firstly, short-term measures that could have an immediate effect that are designed to create a stronger regulatory framework. Jacob can unpack some of these in more detail, but for instance, we advocate somewhat controversially for domestic terrorism legislation. Then we talk about medium-term measures that are designed to strengthen civil society that could have meaningful impacts over the next 5 to 10 years. And this gets very much more into the realm of social media, algorithmic reform, reforming Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, and so on. And then finally, longer term measures designed to build national unity and also break the cycle of regeneration that we talk about has sustained this movement very clearly on the historical trajectory we described that culminates in January 6 or culminates on January 6, 2021, which really has a very clear 40-year or 4-decade-long throughput, but obviously it has deeper roots. I mean, this, of course, assumes a more effective Congress than we've had in recent years, but nonetheless, it was important for us to lay out what is we hope were practical and attainable, and what would be more aspirational and desirable. And maybe Jacob, you can give some examples, and then we can open it up for questions.
Yeah, sure. I think one thing that's important, Bruce, is the fact that obviously you and I have spoken now about the chronological narrative of the book. But another thing that we really try to do is pull out some of the big themes. And the reason why I think that's important to point out is because it's those themes that are really going to translate to our counterterrorism recommendations. So communications is a huge theme, and we trace how the far right has been on the cutting edge of social media and communications technology really since the early 80s. So of course, social media regulation is a big topic in our recommendations section. We speak in favor of Section 230 reform, arguing that basically social media companies have lost the right to determine for themselves how to police their platforms. Another one that's quite controversial is the repetition of the theme of military infiltrations. Really difficult actually to read through the book. I think it's one of the things that's quite upsetting is the extent to which this movement has very effectively both infiltrated the United States military, but also radicalized veterans. And so we talk about how you can push back against that. Tactics and targeting. Bruce mentioned a piece that we have currently out in Just Security. We also have a piece out in War on the Rocks that looks at the transition from explosive devices that we saw at Oklahoma City and Atlanta Olympic Park towards firearms. So Bruce and I spend a lot of time in our recommendations section talking about gun control and how you would implement gun control or firearm measures as part of a counterterrorism strategy. Really, it's our recommendation section is, I think, an 8 or a 9 point strategy to try to push back, and it all leads up to this end point, which is trying to, having a realization that we need to kind of rebuild civility, we need to rebuild trust in the system in this country. I'll just point out one thing that is concerning. 3 consecutive new presidents, President Obama, President Trump, President Biden, and their elections have all had significant impacts on this movement. We're heading into we're in an election year at which we're arguably more divided than ever. So this topic has to be, unfortunately, very much front of mind for us. And we need to appreciate that there are very few moments in American politics that are more effective at radicalizing people towards violence than elections. So we really need to be, I hope that some of the things that Bruce and I talk about in our recommendations section can be helpful as we embark on this new chapter in American electoral history, because it's going to impact the violent far right later this year. We'll turn it back to you, Peter, and happy to answer any questions.
Okay, and just again for the audience, you have a question, put it in the Slido. I see a number of questions have already come in. So you mentioned, I think, Jacob, that after Oklahoma City, there was a pretty intense FBI crackdown on the militia movement. And after January 6th, there've been some 1,000 arrests, there've been hundreds of convictions, there've been sentences of up to 22 years. For some of the leaders, there have been charges of seditious conspiracy, which is a very hard charge to get a conviction on, and sometimes has failed in the past because it's also rarely invoked as a charge. So do you think that, I was struck by how few and small and ineffective the pro-Trump demonstrations were when he was indicted 3 or 4 times after January 6th. And so is that an indication that the kinds of people who might have been inclined to come out are just not coming out because they've seen the sentences, they've seen the convictions?
In 1983, and then again in 1992, a prominent member of this movement, a leader of the KKK called Louis Beam, penned essays about a strategy that he called Leaderless Resistance. Leaderless resistance is basically a strategy that says, rather than operate in groups that have kind of that engage publicly and have hierarchies and public communications that can be intercepted, this movement needs to operate in small cells and as individuals who can operate below the radar and not be vulnerable to government infiltrations. I think that the crackdown in the 90s and the seditious conspiracy cases now against groups like the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys prove him right, in the sense that when you organize publicly, as those groups did, you leave yourself vulnerable to those kind of interceptions. The problem with that, Peter, is, okay, January 6th included a lot of organizations that came together, and it included a lot of momentum, a wide network. But when you go through a lot of the other incidents that I mentioned, from the Oslo attack to Christchurch, El Paso, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, they did not involve groups. They involved individuals. And so I take your point that, maybe there's a limitation of that organizational capacity, and you're not going to have big groups that get together to rally in places like, at courthouses or political sites. But I think you still might have lone actor violence. I'll point to one case a couple of days after the initial FBI search of Mar-a-Lago, which immediately kind of sparked a huge backlash in the media, and the conservative media, and on the far right against kind of, government overreach. You had a lone actor who conducted an attack at the Cincinnati FBI headquarters, tried to enter, couldn't, ended up leading police on a chase and was killed in a field. That remains a threat. And so perhaps, the crackdowns on the groups will be a deterrent against having these kind of large organizational gatherings. But I still think the threat from lone actors remains very, very strong.
Yeah, but I mean, to reflect back on a debate that Bruce is familiar with because he was on one side of it 15 years ago, about kind of what's more a significant threat, an organized group who can actually, obviously it's easier to penetrate, but you can actually carry out a fairly large attack, versus a lone actor. I mean, the ceiling on a lone actor in the United States is Omar Mateen, who was a lone actor inspired by ISIS, who killed 49 people. on a Saturday night at 2 a.m. in a nightclub, which is a sort of almost ideal environment to kill as many people as possible because it was, he had every advantage. And obviously on 9/11, an organized group of people killed 3,000 almost people, Americans. So, I accepting, yes, that lone actors are just, that's just they're very hard to dissuade and deter and but the group, it wasn't a bunch of lone actors didn't descend on January 6th. There were lone actors, but it was, the reason it was so effective is thousands of people listened to President Trump, and 1,000 of them have been indicted for one crime or another. So I'm just reflecting because we know this is coming.
Mm-hmm.
If Trump could win the election, he could lose the election. I think either way there can be quite a lot of violence. But if it's unorganized and lone actors, does that, what's the difference?
Well, like I argued a decade and a half ago, it's both. It's not an either or choice. I think, Jacob is quite right to say that the aggressive prosecution and conviction of nearly 24 people on seditious conspiracy, as you noted, Peter, that's a very difficult charge to prove. And one of the most serious in a democracy. That will have an effect, I would argue, of driving people and even groups deeper underground. What we're not going to see is what we saw on January 6th, this people wearing patches or colors of various organizations. It's not to say that there's not going to be some organized dimension to it. But I think this is what underscores the diffusion and enigmatic dimensions of this threat. Obviously, even for lone actors, there has to be an overriding ideology. And this is an ideological movement that has borrowed from virtually every sector of extremism, whether it's anti-tax, whether it's anti-government at any level above the county sheriff, whether it's racism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, anti-LGBTQ, and so on. And it's a big tent that brings in a lot of people from diverse ideological perspectives, but have a common aim, which is basically to overthrow what they often call ZOG, the Zionist occupation government. That's how little, how their low esteem they regard the federal government. The problem is a lone individual like Omar Mateen. But for me, the real threat is right in the middle. It's when you get a bunch of lone individuals who coalesce into a cell and then start to think bigger. So a classic example of this would be the Michigan Wolverines, as they called themselves, the small number of people, fewer than half a dozen, that met in Michigan over Facebook and decided to seriously plot to kidnap and then to try and execute the sitting governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer. That to me is the kind of threat. I think as Jacob was talking about earlier, Louis Beam conceived of this leaderless resistance strategy not only to be about lone wolf attacks, but to generate a series of lone wolf attacks, sort of brush fires that would come together in a giant conflagration. And that to me is the worry, is that you're going to get maybe not top-down, stereotypical, traditional terrorist organizations with a command and control, but rather you'll get enough like-minded people that are joined together on the internet that are going to start to plot and plan amongst themselves. And another example of how this gathered really unprecedented momentum was in the basically in the spring of 2021, when you had 75,000 people on Facebook openly talking about the Boogaloo. Basically, that was the patois, the code for the overthrow of the U.S. government. So the trouble is, small numbers of people can come together and do enormously consequential things. And I'll just leave you with one more example. Brandon Russell, who was one of the co-founders of Atomwaffen, which is a terrorist group. It's been designated as such by other countries, in fact. He served 5 years in prison, not nearly as much as, let's say, people who provide material support to ISIS, for instance, who serve on average 13.4 years. And literally, as soon as he got out of prison, he banded together with someone he had met while incarcerated, and they exactly a year ago plotted to black out Baltimore, to blow up the power transmission, the power transformers that fed electricity to the city. So you have a small number of people thinking enormously big. Maybe that wouldn't have resulted in lots of casualties in a 9/11 type of attack. But seriously, if you could carry out a succession of bombings of these substations, you could have a good chance of blacking out a city and leaving the authorities scrambling in how to counter that.
How do you, so we know from recent polling that more and more Republicans think that the FBI instigated the January 6th attack, and we've had the president, Trump, former president, talk about the January 6th hostages, and that message has been echoed by Stefanik, who after all is one of the leaders of the House. And, you know, there seems to be a real shift in how many Republicans view what happened on January 6th that has taken place in the last, and well, by the way, it's not been prompted by Trump. There was a very good piece in the Post. It was the grassroots that prompted this rethink that then Trump picked up on. It didn't come from him originally. He was keeping a pretty low profile, but the idea that, you know, Ashley Babbitt is sort of some kind of secular martyr, that, you know, there was just a bunch of tourists who came on January 6th, and that if anything bad happened, it was FBI sort of instigated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is now not a minority view. This is a somewhat mainstream view amongst Republicans. So what does that mean? Because we talked a lot about the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys and also lone actors, but this is a very substantial group of people in the Republican Party. And then take that together with the rising approval ratings amongst both the left and the right, you know, the polling, Jacob and Bruce, that violence to serve their political ends is now being embraced by more and more people, both on the left and the right. So the fact that these ideas are getting more mainstream, what does that mean?
Well, that's the biggest difference between today and, let's say, the 1980s and the 1990s, is that these were fringe ideas then that embraced conspiracy theories and acquired some very limited currency propagating those conspiracy theories. But this is why in our policy recommendations, we talk about algorithmic reform and Section 230, is because social media has, you know, basically become a megaphone for this.
Well, just so everybody understands what we're talking about. So Section 230 is essentially, I think it was 1996, I think, right? It says that social media platforms are not responsible in a legal sense for what is on that. They can't be sued for what's on that platform. Is that correct? So
Right.
if you were obviously, social media companies have made trillions of dollars because of this 25-word kind of Section 230, right? It's very brief, but it says they can't be sued. So we have seen civil suits against social media companies saying essentially, but for the propaganda that, you know, somebody was imbibing, my son or daughter would be alive. And those suits, as far as I can tell, have never really succeeded so far. But, you know, that could change. But how would you reword sort of Section 230 so that it was, and I guess two parts to this. One, what is the rewording that you would like? And two, what is the rewording that's politically possible, given the fact that you're dealing with the richest companies in the world who presumably would be pushing back pretty heavily against something that has laid a lot of golden eggs?
Right. Well, I'll start. I mean, none of it's really possible. I mean, this is not a Congress that works in a bipartisan way and that has been effective with legislation. So it remains more aspirational, but I think nonetheless important. I mean, I'm old enough to remember in the 1990s that the conventional wisdom back then was that the internet was going to be an engine of enlightenment and education that was going to bring the truth to everyone and put everyone on an equal playing field of verified knowledge. That hasn't panned out. I think it's safe to say. Also, that was an era when, I think quite rightly, Congress was encouraging the development of Silicon Valley and of these tech companies. So it made sense. Thirdly, that was an era, too, when the overwhelming majority of Americans got their news from traditional media sources, whether it was the evening news on every major network at 7 p.m., or whether it was, you know, conventional, actually hard copy newspapers, or authoritative radio shows. I mean, now we are in a position where a recent poll from the Reuters Institute at Oxford University showed that, over a third of people between 18 and 40 are getting their news from social influencers, from TikTok and from Instagram, not from verified news sources. And as you well know, Peter, as a distinguished journalist for decades, journalists have multiple sources for what they write. It's then vetted by an editor and fact-checked. I mean, the times I've journeyed into long-form journalism when I used to write for The Atlantic, I mean, there were fact-checkers that went through everything that I wrote. I mean, obviously, there's a very different process on social media where there's no verification. So it suggests that the confines of Section 230 are an anachronism. Now, what we talk about in the book, which I think is very important, is that in 2018, the Home Office in the United Kingdom, together with the Ministry of Culture, Digital Media, and Sport, sat down and wrote a white paper laying out as a basis for discussion and debate in Parliament what government owes its citizens to keep them safe in this new environment. And the Online Harms White Paper, which you can easily find and Google it, is really, I would call it a magisterial work. I mean, it was a very brave and bold effort to lay out these responsibilities, not just in countering extremism or terrorism, but in regulating abuse of children online, for example, what constitutes online bullying, for example, and the deleterious effects that has, especially on teenagers and often young female teenagers, and so on. And was an attempt to map out and debate and discuss this in the legislature. I mean, we're nowhere close to having that. So we need, I think.
Can I ask you something, though? Because,
yeah.
I mean, obviously, there's going to be a lot of politics here. But, I mean, if you look at the mood in Congress about social media companies on both the left and the right, there's quite a lot of agreement around things like, well, maybe, sort of age limits, around consumption of certain kinds of social media. I mean, the political environment is sort of ripe for a moment where the social media companies would face increased regulation, something the social media companies have themselves said they would embrace, even though nothing has happened so far. So, I mean, is it so politically impossible to say, I mean, how would you change it in the dreamer vision, and what would you think is politically possible?
I would hold them responsible for their content the same way that traditional media has been. And the argument for that is that social media now is far more powerful and more influential, especially amongst the demographic they appeal to, than traditional media.
Well, and AI also introduces something very interesting into this, because we're just leaping ahead a bit, because this bad content is presumably going to be manufactured by AI. I saw, I think, in the Times yesterday about 4chan folks sort of manufacturing a lot of content. That's an additional wrinkle, because would you hold the would you hold, for instance, OpenAI responsible for violent incitement if an AI program created it based on somebody else's content?
That's a great question, and one I actually haven't thought of, but I would say yes, because of the poisonous effects that these sorts of platforms are having. I mean, let me give you an example, and you'll be very familiar with this. In the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, the United States rightly criticized and pressured various other countries, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, for providing the ideological framework that sustained violent Salafi jihadism, in essence, and called them out about it. We're in a difficult position now where many of our closest European allies view the United States in the same light, basically, as acting as a platform.
Well, that goes to one of the questions from the audience, who are, I mean, it's an anonymous question, but the questioner says, a question from Stephen. Historically, American far-right extremism has fed off of European variants. Do you expect this trend to continue, or has American extremism become distinct? And what you're saying, it seems like now we're kind of exporting these ideas to Europe. Is that
and elsewhere?
Yeah.
No, very clearly.
Yeah, and what specifically are we exporting? Is the United States exporting that's sort of new or different, or what is? You mentioned the Great Replacement theory earlier. That I think is a French idea, but obviously it's been embraced by white nationalists in the U.S.
Well, go on.
I'll give you one example that just comes to mind, Peter, based on a few quotes that exist in some of the white supremacist manifestos. Anti-abortion extremism has started to kind of be woven into some white supremacist documents. In October 2022, a mass shooting targeted a gay nightclub or a gay bar in Bratislava, Slovakia, by an individual who said he was inspired by the Buffalo shooting. So again, this is coming US to Europe, and he writes in his manifesto, he kind of reflects on recent abortion developments in the United States, saying, you know, it's only a half victory for white America, he writes, because they're still going to import more people. So again, somebody reflecting on what's happening in the United States. The more clear example, actually from a year and a day ago, is in Brazil, where you have an election riot that happens there, with a very similar kind of mob inspired by very similar grievances, quite a similar leader, attacking a very similar location for very similar reasons.
Which was attacking the parliament in Brasilia, right?
The parliament in Brasilia. And I would note, Peter, I think one of the reasons why I'm also worried about 2024 is people are calling 2024 the year of the election, right? There's 50 elections around the world this year. And the United States, from my perspective, has typically been the city on a hill, right? It's been the democratic kind of rock that other countries have looked to for how to conduct themselves in elections and democratic processes. Now the model for how you conduct elections in America is very, very different than what it used to be a decade or 20 years ago. Right now, we've shown that you can question election results, and you can, mobilize in violence if you disagree with the results. We've seen that exported to Brazil, and I don't see a particularly good reason why we should expect that not to happen again.
Well, this raises a super interesting question that goes to one of your policy recommendations, which is this domestic terrorism statute. Now, there are a bunch of reasons why there's the intelligence community is not allowed to spy on Americans for good reason. So there's that. There's the First Amendment, which is another pretty big thing here, which is it's not illegal for me to be a member of the Ku Klux Klan in this country. It is illegal for me to carry out an act of violence on behalf of the Ku Klux Klan. However, but it is illegal for me to be part of ISIS in this country in any meaningful way, either providing my material support in the form of volunteering to join them or giving them money or whatever. So this domestic terrorism statute hasn't existed, federal terrorism statute hasn't existed for good reason. And yet, on the other hand, as you all laid out very clearly today, there's a bunch of domestic terrorism in the United States that's coming from right-wing extremists, really overwhelmingly now. I mean, the incel terrorists, the black nationalist terrorists, the far-left terrorists, these are a very small percentage of the kinds of, and also even jihadist terrorism is really receded. So how would that domestic terrorism statute on a federal level be written and in a way that was implementable and wasn't subject to judicial sort of essential review and essentially not being, it wouldn't pass muster?
Well, I mean, you hit the nail on the head, really, because it's perfectly legal and rightly so to be an extremist in the United States. It's illegal to be a violent extremist. That's what terrorism is. So let's call it what it is. And I think that would inform this debate that we're having, not least about whether the persons arrested and convicted of various offenses on January 6th are hostages or what else they are. So that's one reason. Call it what it is. Yeah. Secondly, we have hate crimes legislation. People argue we don't need domestic terrorism legislation because murder, assault, kidnapping, bombing, arson, all those things are covered by criminal statutes. Completely true. But yet in the 1990s, we did enact hate crimes legislation, which enables judges to sentence people for 3 times longer than their existing sentence. And I think that's important on 2 levels. Firstly, the hate crimes legislation was agreed upon precisely because these types of crimes were viewed as outside the realm of acceptability in a functioning democracy, as is sedition. And sedition is a violent overthrow of government, which is exactly what terrorists aspire to. So I think we need to be clear in our terminology. Secondly, the desire of Congress was to send a message of the particular opprobrium for these acts. That's why judges are empowered to sentence 3 times longer, which I think is also important. And then the third reason we argue that it's necessary is to bring equity in sentencing. I mean, Brandon Russell, who I described a moment ago, is a case in point, 5 years, whereas the average ISIS supporter who's may have been just recruiting people, not that that's a trivial offense, or raising money, gets, more than double that sentencing. Case in point that drove us to this, to adopt this, was Christopher Hassan, a military veteran who was serving in the Coast Guard, who plotted to kill all the senior leaders of Democratic Congress. Then the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, then the Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, a slew of others, as well as media figures who he viewed as far too liberal. And in the end, he had to be convicted of firearms possession charges combined with narcotics because he was found to have anabolic steroids. So that mattered much more than what he was trying to do. And in fact, the judge had to use terrorism enhancement statutes, which are up to a judge's discretion, to extend his sentence as well. Otherwise, it would have been a fraction. And then what Jacob and I argue is that with the right guardrails, with the right congressional oversight, by specifically, we don't advocate designating domestic groups as terrorists. As you point out, Peter, that would be a road to disaster and would be just mired in debate and partisanship. But what we do say is that when these particular crimes cross the line into violence or conspiring to commit violence, we should call them what they are, and not, as we have been for the past 30 years, dancing around that it's not terrorism, it's something else.
Agreed. I mean, and I think it would, particularly that last point, I mean, as speaking as a member of the press, I mean, I think that the media, it's helpful if there is the ability to call it what it actually is, and also from a legal perspective. And I think, so one thing that I've never quite understood, Bruce and Jacob, and maybe you can kind of sort this out, because it does seem that sometimes prosecutors do add a terrorism component to the charge. Is that because it's at the state level rather than the federal level? Because I do see occasionally that the term terrorism is used in an indictment. And I know there isn't a federal terrorism statute, but is there is there some discretion at the state level?
There's 2 things, Peter. So there's what Bruce mentioned, which is a terrorism enhancement, which is up to the judge, and it is not necessarily easy to do. There are also state level terrorism charges, domestic terrorism charges. So the New York Buffalo shooter that I mentioned, he has a domestic terrorism charge at the state level. I'm quite interested in the New York State domestic terrorism legislation, because one of the things that Bruce and I often hear when we get criticism on this argument is that this law would be weaponized by a right-wing politician to go after things like Black Lives Matter. And so Bruce and I talk about guardrails, making sure the guardrails are quite high. I believe the Buffalo shooting has the New York State domestic terrorism law has guardrails on both question of lethality and also scale. So I think they say has to be 1 fatality and at least 4 injuries, something like that, which is a really interesting kind of specificity in that statute that I think would help protect that law from being weaponized by politicians who have different incentives. So yes, the answer is yes. Some states have that statute, and I think that might be the model for for a federal statute.
The question from the audience, Jack Krupensky, says, how much of the problem is outright mental illness, either as a root cause or an influence that exacerbates the situation?
Jacob, this is your specialty.
I'm also curious for your take, Bruce. My understanding is that mental illness was largely dismissed as a cause of terrorism in the kind of the literature on Salafi jihadi terrorism. I think we're still getting up to speed on that in the far right. Let me point to one group to explain what this kind of looks like, right? I've done a lot of group work on a group called the Antiabortion Division. Bruce mentioned them earlier. The Antiabortion Division was founded in about 2017 and was responsible for 5 murders perpetrated by 3 perpetrators. The leader of that group, Brandon Russell, as well as all 3 perpetrators of violence, all have a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. So it's a factor. And we talk about that in the book. It's one of our recommendations under countering violent extremism, the countering violent extremism bucket. It's not just mental illness. It's also histories of being bullied, histories of violence in the home, histories of trauma, all of which we put into a bigger category of basically vulnerabilities to radicalization. And we do have to have a conversation about what those vulnerabilities to radicalization are. How do you combat them in a way that's sensitive and appropriately serious? But it's a really important question. And I think we're still kind of getting up to speed in it. On that.
A related question, which you've sort of hinted at. I mean, we talk about domestic terrorism. I think a lot of terrorists are perpetrators of domestic violence, and I don't know of a really good study, but I just from my anecdotal, Omar Mateen had assaulted his first wife, who was, of course, the most lethal terrorist since 9/11 US. I think he was also abusing his second wife. And it would just be common sense that somebody who was willing to do that at home may be willing to do it elsewhere. And so I'm just wondering if you have any views on that issue.
Well, it's documented that adherents of, of far-right ideologies, particularly a group, the Order of the Nine Angels, also deal in child pornography. And, I mean, all sorts of other, societal dysfunctionary types of activities. It goes back, as exactly Jacob said, is that, for decades, the argument was that terrorists were, quote unquote, normal, no different from mainstream society. But don't forget, when those arguments were propagated, and especially in the 1970s and the 1980s, the demographic of people becoming terrorists was much smaller than it is today. You think back to the Baader Meinhof gang in West Germany. I mean, at its height, it never had more than 36 people, for example. I mean, you're talking about much smaller groups. The demographic now just generally has changed so much that we are finding more mental health issues. But this has always been, the holy grail in terrorism studies, to find out why someone becomes a terrorist, why some people are more easily radicalized than others. And what we've consistently found is that there may be a number of factors, including mental health, but there isn't one universal reason that we can pinpoint or focus on why someone turns to violence. And that remains elusive. But I think you're quite right to point it out that in this movement, as Jacob has just described, I mean, there is a high incidence of mental health issues.
Peter, can I just make one last quick point?
Yeah.
Social media here has been revolutionary in this space, because typically those kind of children, right? One of the things that's happened is it's not just a rise in mental illness, it's also terrorists are getting younger. And typically guardrails against that kind of radicalization included, parents and schools and sports coaches and therapists. Social media has completely bypassed all of those. And this is part of the reason why I think Bruce and I feel so strongly about social media reform is, if you're having children with autism spectrum disorder being radicalized to neo-Nazism on social media, something is broken. And we've got to go back and find what that problem is. And I think that's why Bruce and I feel so adamantly that social media companies have given up the right to determine for themselves what content gets to be on those platforms, because they have not acted responsibly. And so it's time for somebody else to act responsibly and enforce those standards on them.
We're going to have to leave it there, because we, like the Council on Foreign Relations, end things on time. I want to thank our virtual audience, and also want to thank Dr. Bruce Hoffman and Jacob Ware, and congratulate them on their new book. And hopefully you've had a chance perhaps to buy it. There is on screen, there is a place you can buy the book. God's God, Guns, and Sedition, Far-Right Terrorism in America. And good luck on the rest of the book tour, gentlemen.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having us, Peter.
Bye. See you.